when we did that class.
Okay, so welcome back to Existentialism, Myth of Sisyphus, Day 2. We're going to finish out the book. Looking forward to the next 3 weeks of class. We have Existentialism as a Humanism. For next week, you're to read the whole book, or like the most of it that I chunked out, which involves, you don't have to read the introduction or the comments on a stranger, or even some of the debate that happens at the end of Sartre's lecture. So that was, it's like a recording of a live lecture that Sartre gave. Those are like his lecture notes, basically. So that'll be next week. And then the 2 weeks following that, we have the Ethics of Ambiguity, which is going to be our most challenging and most amount of reading. When we get closer to it, I might change the assignment, because I have us reading like 80 pages one week and then 100 pages the next week, which is intense. And they're like not easy pages either. But then there's just not time to like give the book the full treatment it needs, as well as have done everything that we've done. So if there's a way that I can pare it down, I will. So I'll be looking into that. So, you know, just keep your eyes peeled for updates to the syllabus. But if not, then, you know, we'll just read the whole book, which it's a great book. It'll be a good cap for everything we've done this summer so far. Great. So just some administrative stuff before we begin with the philosophy. We have, like I just mentioned, we have 3 lectures left after this one. This is one of 4 that is it for us. And then we all go our separate ways and live our own lives and move on and be happy, productive, absurd heroes. And the reading does get more complex and longer. I've been working with several students to help set a plan in place to get grades on track. Again, the structure of this course is you earn the points yourself. I've made them available for everybody to earn in all sorts of different ways. They're out there, they're easy to get. I don't want this to be a hard class to pass or do well. But I do need you to like choose to do well, right? And that's the hardest part. That's like what the real grade is. And consistent with our lecture material too is I want you all to not feel constrained and to exercise your freedom and making your own success, right? Your own meaning or whatever. So if you need some help getting on track, making a plan, getting settled in so that you know that you're going to pass the class or get the grade that you want to get, and you're not sure how to make that work, reach out to me. This is for, you know, everybody here in lecture and in the future as well. Send me an email and we can work something out to make sure that it all works out as it should and as you want it to. So for instance, right now, discussion posts require, in order to get the full points, interaction with your classmates to get full credit. You not only have to ask a question, you have to respond to other people's questions and respond to the responses to your question if you want full points for a week's worth of discussion points. Okay, so and you can only earn each like portion of discussion points like once in a week's session. So if you wait until the very end to get, can someone in person get the door for me? The door is open, AJ.
Oh, the building closes at 5.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so resuming recording, Paul is going to go let AJ in. Discussion posts require interaction, and interaction is impossible if you do it all at the last minute. But many of your classmates are very active right now on the discussion boards. Now is a very good time to take advantage of the hype and earn your points. So if you want to earn your course grade through discussion posts, now is the time to do it. Don't wait until 3 weeks have passed thinking that, you know, well, the due date isn't till 3 or 4 weeks from now, so I'll just do them all then. You won't be able to get all of your points that way. You need to like interact, and that requires starting a little bit early and ideally right now. And there's a whole lot of really interesting and awesome discussion on the boards. So for those of you who have been taking part, thank you. I've enjoyed reading them all. I think you guys are learning from each other, which is absolutely the goal. So good job so far on those. The final exam will cover the more challenging readings and topics, but it's worth another 50 points, right? That's 50% of your grade that's earnable. But it's going to be built the same way that the midterm was, where there'll be 4 prompts and you choose 3 of them and you answer those 3 prompts. It is the same exact thing except in content, and the content will cover this sort of more accelerated and challenging content right here at the end of the semester. So that's coming up as well. It's optional, of course, but that's another 50 points that you can earn to get your grade where you want it to be. And you'll also have a little bit longer than a week to complete the exam if you choose to take it. And in that week, I'll be completely responsive to content-based questions. So I won't read a draft of your exam because it's an exam, but I will answer any content-based questions like, hey, what I don't understand what Camus says about the absurd artwork. What is that? What is it supposed to mean? And I'll write out a full answer. I might even do like a review session, but we'll see about that too. Thanks, Paul. Great. So the last way to earn points is by writing the optional paper, which is for 25 points. Send me a thesis or a paragraph statement, like 1 sentence or a few sentences that says, here's the topic I want to write on, here's what I'm going to argue. It basically give me enough so that I can trust that you have a structured idea that will be a recipe for success in actually producing a paper. So if you say, I want to write a paper on the myth of Sisyphus, that's not a topic. That's not something I can approve, right? But if you say, I want to write a paper on Salvador Dali's 10-minute surrealist film, arguing that it is a work of absurd art, then that's a little bit more substance for me. It'd be better to give me even a little bit more because then I can communicate with you and help offer some suggestions and ideas, but that would be enough to get a topic approved, sort of at a bare minimum. And that's, again, 25 points. The due date for getting a topic approved is, I think, July 26th. And the paper is due, I want to say, August 4th or 10th or something. Grades are due August 16th. And I need at least a week to go through all the papers. So I'm sure I set the due date to like August 4th or slightly after. So get doing that quickly as well if you would like to write a paper. Oh yeah, there it is. I wrote it on the slide. July 26th is the date to get a topic approved, and August 4th is the paper due date. And as always, if you need help, reach out. I want to see everybody learn, pass, and excel. So help me help you guys do that. Great. Any questions about administration, stuff, grades, etc., all of the above so far before we move on to today's lecture content?
I have a question.
Okay.
So you, if I understood correctly, you said we can't post on multiple discussions for points within 1 week. Is that right?
Yeah. So the way that the discussion points are set up is that you can only earn each allotted grade like in 1 week's session once. So you can earn, I think it's like 2 points from asking a question once. You can earn the 3 points from responding to someone's response to your question once, and you can respond to another student's question once and earn those 10 points. And you can do that. There's 10 discussion posts. So there's a total of 100 possible discussion points. But you couldn't just respond to 2 students' questions and earn 10 points for that week. You'd have to go through the process of asking your own and then responding, right? And the idea here is in making that part of the grade optional and also capable of being like 100% of the course's grade value, is that the lesson to be learned in discussion is not just in regurgitating content or satisfying some end goal, but rather like engaging with your classmates, right? Is that it's putting the philosophy into practice. And as long as you're doing that, then, I think that I'll have satisfied my own needs and qualifications for, like being a professor in that situation. So I think that you guys learn when you learn from each other, and that requires the interaction and engagement.
And can we go back to past weeks discussion
Yes,
and get points? Okay.
absolutely. So all of the discussion boards are open for the entire summer session or until the due date. I think it might be on the syllabus, and if it's not, then I need to put it on there. But it'll be like about August 4th, right, with the paper, so that I'll have time to go through and grade everything. But you can comment on any of the discussion posts within the grade parameters that's on the syllabus from any week until the final due date at the end of the semester. Cool. Any other questions? Session boards, papers, tests? Great. Okay. Last time I made this meme. This is my first one that I made this semester. Last time in the myth of Sisyphus, we learned that the world is absurd. Hello. In response to the absurdity of I suppose it's not the world that's absurd, but our relationship to the world, right? The relationship between being human and being a part of the world is absurd. And that the two natural, naive or unreflective, pre-reading the myth of Sisyphus responses to this relationship of absurdity is to commit suicide, to say it's all too much for me, or to commit philosophical suicide, to take a leap or to turn away from, right, the absurdity of your existence in the world. So philosophical suicide is a kind of living unauthentically, sort of lie to yourself. You know that the world is absurd, and that if you really bring the essentialism of your or idealism that you're using to turn away from the absurd to its logical conclusion, so says Camus, then it will become absurd too. There's no escaping it. That eventually, no matter what, you're going to end up in the absurd, and you know that when you started out thinking in this new way, and you're going to end up knowing it in the end, and all of that in between time will have been inauthentic. But there's a middle path, says Camus in the first half of the Myth of Sisyphus. And that middle path is to hold a constant, lucid awareness of the absurd, to not turn away, to stare it head on. And from this lucid awareness, Camus draws his three consequences: his revolt, his freedom, and his passion. And what we see, and what I indicated last week, was maybe a specious argument or not an argument at all, or at least in my estimation questionable, which is not to say that it's incorrect or the wrong way to think, but it's not clear how strong the deduction from revolt, freedom, passion is to a life of quantity over quality, but we'll talk about that today. It'll be one of the main topics of today's lecture. But the idea is that by engaging in this constant lucid awareness of the absurd, that we live a life of quantity over one of quality, and this becomes the like modus of our practical reasoning, how we decide what to do. But how does the absurd hero live? How does the person who lives with this constant lucid awareness of the absurd do? And what does a life of quantity look like? Right? And this is the question or the problem that Camus deals with in part 2 of the Myth of Sisyphus. Okay, so the lover, the actor, the adventurer, these are his three characters. In part 2, Camus gives us 3 different characters who exemplify living with a completely lucid awareness of the absurd. And it's not a direct overlap, but I thought this was kind of interesting that Nietzsche has his own 3 like exemplar characters in the philosopher, the saint, and the artist. And Camus has the lover, the actor, and the adventurer. And I suppose I should say at the outset, I just used the word exemplar. Camus is very careful. In fact, if not even careful, then just like almost vehement. He very strongly says, look, these people aren't meant to be examples. You're not meant to live like them. You're meant to live in your own way. You're meant to live in the way that like fate has forced you to face the absurd, and to not turn away from that. So don't take these people as they have it right. So if I do like they do, then I'll have it right too. That's the wrong way of reading the absurd hero. Rather, there's something like a form or a method that these guys exemplify, who through which that method might be workable in yourself, though the products of that method will be purely your own, distinctly your own, individually so. So don't be a philosopher, an artist, or saint. Be you, but here are ways in which it works for these sorts, the lover, the actor, and the adventurer. Okay, so as it happens, anyone in that spirit can live an absurd life in any form. You can be a lover, an actor, an adventurer, or you could be a clerk at an office, or a football player, or Diogenes living out of a barrel, right? And this is because in the void of absurdity, all things are equal, right? This is the premise from which Camus infers to his life of quantity. And he says, everyone is equally privileged in this way, which is almost egalitarian, almost. And it might be perfectly egalitarian if it weren't for the rampant philosophical suicide of our everyday world that we live in. That the philosophical suicide that our world in real life is committed to, and at such a vast scale, perpetuates and creates its own absurd degree of privilege. But if all of us were just to recognize the deep absurdity and be aware of the impossibility of being, though we are, then we would all be equally privileged in such a realization. So common qualities shared by absurd heroes are: one, living without appeal. And what this means is that one accepts fate, but doesn't regard fate, right? Doesn't say like, oh, hey, this fate is, I'm really glad that this is my destiny. Like Hercules in the Disney movie, like satisfies his destiny and it's a happy ending. No, the idea here is more like Oedipus, right? Where Oedipus accepts his fate, but doesn't regard it. He says, all is well in the end, but doesn't accept responsibility for the actions that he's performed. And that's because he's performed them unknowingly, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other common quality is living consistent with an ethic of quantity, right? Is with this awareness of the absurdity of an existence in a world that cannot provide us the meaning or unity or rationality that we require of it. We ought to, maybe is the right way of putting it. I'm not sure if the normative language is exactly appropriate in this case, but at least the form of reasoning that we take is one of quantity rather than of quality. And finally, absurd reason or intelligence or logic dominates. So absurd reason and absurd intelligence, absurd logic dominates the absurd hero's conceptualizations, thinking, navigating through the world. Okay, so we'll chat about each of these defining features of the absurd hero in turn. First of which being fate. So as Camus says, the absurd does not liberate, it binds. We're slaves to it, right? It's like the slaves of antiquity. It does not authorize all actions. Everything is permitted, which is what Ivan says in Brothers Karamazov, right? Does not mean nothing is forbidden. The absurd merely confers an equivalence on the consequences of those actions. It does not recommend crime, for this would be childish, but it restores remorse to its futility. What's Camus saying here? Well, what he's saying is that, look, if fate has forced us into this kind of existence, everything is permissible is a kind of like absurd logic jump that you take from that, right? Because everything is equal in the void of the absurd. Nothing makes any difference to anything else. And it's not to recommend crime to say that everything is permitted, because that would be vulgar, right? And it would be vulgar in the sense that you were making an absurd. It would be that would be kind of philosophical suicide. It would be making the conclusion that the world, our existence in it, is absurd, and then permitting yourself to do harm and say, well, it's okay for me to do what I want to do, and that might be stealing from people, taking advantage of them, this sort of thing, breaking the law, being in the famous descriptor of Dostoevsky, a scoundrel. All of his characters who have these existential crises with themselves call themselves scoundrels. Anyways, that's what it would be to be a scoundrel. Rather, the idea is just that in the light of, or lack thereof, of the void, the absurd, we are equal in all actions. Nothing is better or worse than anything else. There's no moral hierarchy of action. There just is, right? And what is absurd, bar none. Okay, so because of this, Oedipus at the outset obeys fate without knowing it. But from the moment he knows, his tragedy begins. And if you guys have read the Theban plays, this is true, right? So Oedipus is this hero of Thebes who saves the city from destruction and solves the Sphinx's riddle. And because he solves the riddle and saves Thebes from destruction, they make him king by marrying him to the current queen, whose husband was mysteriously murdered several years ago. And so he marries the queen and is like the hero of the city, has a family. He has 2 sons and 2 daughters. And what happens is Apollo sends down his arrows to the city, which Apollo was the god of archery and of plague and sickness. And so when Apollo sends his arrows, it just means that he's sending like plague arrows into people and killing them. And so the fields go barren, the crops die, the animals die, and people are becoming sick. And so the like high priest does a sacrifice and says that there's been some terrible sin that's been caused in Thebes. Someone has married their mother and is, like being incestuous and all this. And it turns out it's Oedipus, but Oedipus doesn't know this at the outset. He says, well, great, now we know what's going on. Let's find this guy and kick him out. And whoever does this, I'm going to do great harm and violence to him so that we can save all of Thebes, not knowing that he's the one that's committed all these terrible sins, right? But at the moment that Oedipus knows, his tragedy begins. He goes through all this like historical process of talking to people who have old stories and finds that he has a scar that is described as, this abandoned baby. And the story ends up lining up and connecting, and turns out that Oedipus murdered a guy on the road to Thebes because the guy was a jerk to him, said like, hey, you're poor and alone, get out of my way. And Oedipus got angry and said, no, I won't move for you, not if you're going to be a jerk. And so he killed him. It seems a little aggressive to me, but that's the story. And then the rest of the story happens, and Queen of Thebes is now widowed and marries her. It turns out that she's Oedipus's mother. And the reason Oedipus doesn't know this, and Oedipus's father that he kills on the road doesn't know that it's his son that's murdering him, is because Oedipus's father, Tyrus, I think, something like that, had this prophecy when Oedipus was born that his son would kill him and take over his kingdom. And so as soon as he has a son, he throws the son out to the goats to die on a hill, but a goat herd takes care of him. And then, Oedipus murders dad, prophecy fulfilled, marries mother, has sister daughters and brother sons, 2 of each, and is the cause of the plague in Thebes. And it's when he finds this out that his tragedy begins. And his wife finds out slightly before he does. And she kills herself, right? She can't handle it. She says, Oedipus, don't seek the truth. Don't find out. don't ask any more questions. And Oedipus says, I have to know. I can't say no. And so when he discovers in the final moment, he comes back to find his wife having killed herself, and in his distress takes her golden necklace and takes each piece and stabs himself in the eyes, blinds himself, and then roams the land for the rest of his life, and has all sorts of other tragedies. That all of Oedipus's family is tragic. They're cursed. So the moment that he finds out is when the tragedy begins, because he's just been a good guy. He's been a good king, besides like the kind of aggressive early murder. He saves the city and has a loving family, and everybody in Thebes loves him. But unknowingly, he's married his mother and made daughter, sisters, and brother sons with his mother. He's been incestuous, right? And it's the knowledge of this that creates the great tragedy, that fate is what is responsible for his sin, not his own willful actions. Okay. So at the same moment, blind and desperate, having stabbed out his eyes using the jewelry, the bloody jewelry of his dead mother wife, he realizes that the only bond linking him to the world is the cool hand of a girl, his daughter Antigone. As he's blindly wandering through the land, Antigone finds him and takes care of him. And she's his connection to love and humanity, and redeems him. That he finds redemption through the love of his daughter and through Antigone. And so at the end of his life, at the end of Oedipus's life, having been saved by the love of his daughter, he makes a tremendous remark which rings out: despite so many ordeals, despite what fate has imposed upon me, my advanced age and the nobility of my soul make me conclude that all is well, right? And this is powerful, because Oedipus has suffered like no one in all of history has suffered. And it wasn't because he chose wrongly. He did everything right. And yet he was cursed from the outset by fate. And so what he does is he accepts his fate, but he does not regard it. And it's because he stares fate right in the face. He stares at his absurd existence and says, screw you, I'm not responsible for this, but I understand that I am the one through which this tragedy has occurred, and I've suffered for it. And it's due to the nobility of my soul, in spite of all this, that I can conclude that all is well. This is the absurd hero. So the absurd in this way is kind of like determinism, which says that we don't have the power to do otherwise, that our free will is limited. The effects of our will are without ultimate purpose, that in a determined world, we might decide something and think that we've decided freely, but it was really just like, natural law working through us. We're all just balls rolling down hills, billiard balls bouncing off of each other. We don't have control, even though it might feel that way. That's what a determinist says. And for the determinist, the effects of our will have no ultimate purpose. We're just billiard balls bouncing off of each other, balls rolling down hills, right? Water flowing downstream. Similarly, with the absurd, the effect of our will is without an ultimate purpose. There's no reason to will one way or another. And we're not necessarily bound by natural law and the natural order. We might be. It would probably be something close to a philosophical suicide to make such a strong metaphysical claim. But we are at least all committed to an absurd existence at bottom. And recognizing this absurd existence affords us revolt, freedom, and passion, the three consequences. It's a rebellion without win conditions, because at bottom, everything's absurd and will continue to be. You can rebel, but you cannot win your rebellion, but you rebel anyways. And it's a freedom that doesn't liberate you such that the effects of your will have an ultimate purpose, that you can act for the sake of things, that you can act with ends and goals in mind and achieve those ends and goals. No, it only liberates in spirits, like the slaves of antiquity, right? Who are liberated in knowing that they're not responsible for their chains. And it's a passion without ultimate satisfaction, that we act, but we're never satisfied. The absurd is never able to become anything more or less or other than what it is. And though we might passionately rebel against it, it will not change. Okay. But in spite of all of this, it is still possible, so says Camus, to live in this state and conclude, as Oedipus does, that all is well. And we may not succeed, But in depleting ourselves against the void of absurdity, we may still find inner repose and calm. And this is what Camus' project in the second half of the Myth of Sisyphus is supposed to indicate to us, how we can get that affective state of mind and being when faced towards the absurd, such that we can conclude like Oedipus, like Sisyphus, maybe even Prometheus, that all is well, like the absurd hero. Good. And this is just all that I've already said about Oedipus.
May I ask a little question here?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so is the sense of responsibility that like Oedipus takes for his choices, like taking his eyes, damaging his eyes, taking his sight, he's living with that, with the sense that all is well, because by virtue of the fact that that was his own choice to do that, that was his own response. I'm trying to figure out where the personal responsibility part gives that sense of peace.
It's not in that he's like made himself suffer. I mean, maybe in part, but the main thrust of the idea is that he's not accepting responsibility for marrying his mother, for having an incestuous relationship, for making, sister daughters and brother sons, and bringing a curse upon his family. That was all done by fate. He didn't, wake up one day and say, hey, mom, you want to get married? That wasn't his idea. She was just the queen of Thebes to him. And so in looking back and accepting fate, but not responsibility, he's able to say all is well, because it wasn't his willful choice that caused those terrible actions and the curse to come upon him. He was sort of just like blown by the winds of fate into those options, into those actions. And it's his acceptance of the fact that that's how he's been blown about, that he can conclude at the end of his life through the nobility of his soul that all is well. He could also scorn fate. He could feel sorry for himself. He could be ignoble, right? He could be a weak character who blames other people or the world or the gods. But no, he just says, I don't accept responsibility for the terrible things that have been done to me, though I accept them. And this is how he's able to conclude that all is well.
So that doesn't come at first, like the blinding of himself is done in agony for the realization, but he accepts that as part of the normal response he might have to such news, and just sees it all in context of this was beyond my control.
Exactly. So the Theban plays, it's a trilogy. It starts at the end and then goes like backwards. So it's Antigone is first, which is at the end of the story, and then it's Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus. And the way the story goes is, as I said about Oedipus, after he stabs his eyes out in like grief and horror, he goes kind of insane for a while and like wanders about and becomes a homeless guy, and nobody knows where he's gone. So he's like completely lost to reason in the world of human existence. And so his brother-in-law Creon takes over Thebes, and Creon is like a despot, tyrannical jerk. Anyways, it takes Oedipus a long time to warm back up to like a reasoned state of being, and it's through like the love of Isthmene and Antigone, his two daughters, and mostly through Antigone, that he's able to recover that. And then eventually he like in Oedipus at Colonus, he goes to Athens, and that's where like his full complete like redemption arc happens. And it's Antigone who like holds his hand and guides him through the wilds of Greece to Athens, to this like grove where he is able to like be redeemed and does ultimately die there as well. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, the process, that process answers my question, how he came to the sense of peace and resolution.
Yeah. So what Oedipus is responsible for, what he would like say, I accept and I'm responsible for, is his redemption, is his coming to accept what has happened through him, though not of his own will, and say this was my life. And that's like the nobility of spirit that he has, which is really strongly reflected in Oedipus at Colonus too. He's a poor beggar, though he has a famous name and an infamous name, really. He's wearing rags and has no money or land or people. He only has his daughter, and still, it's like his nobility of spirit that remains in spite of all of the tragedy that he's experienced, undergone. The moral of the story is don't marry your mother. If that's all that you take away from this class, then that's a success. Small one, but still a success. Okay. And Atticus says the Greeks were dramatic. It's true. They invented drama. So no surprise. Okay, so that is the absurd hero's relationship to fate, or the relationship to the absurd. It's the same, it's analogous, or maybe even just equivalent to what Oedipus does with his fate, the absurdity of his own tragedy, is you accept it, but you deny responsibility. Or, well, maybe it's not denying responsibility, but not taking responsibility, saying, look, what is absurd is not mine, but what is mine I accept. And so all is well. Okay, so the ethic of quantity. I did my best to give a fair shake to Camus' description of the ethic of quantity. So what's going to follow is my best shot at that fair shake by constructing an argument in premise, inference, conclusion form, right? And so we'll work through it, premise, inference, conclusion, and then talk about it at the end. Okay, so one, and this is the argument that Camus gives for like why we need to live with an ethic of quantity, right? Why we need to like live lots rather than really well, because there's no such thing as well in the absurd. But anyways, one, all consequences of action are equal in the absurd, right? This is a premise, this is, Camus says it. The only well-lived life in response to the absurd is to act in rebellion against it, right? Otherwise it's suicide or philosophical suicide. Any action taken, therefore, in rebellion against the absurd will be equally consequential. So if all actions are equal in the absurd and the only appropriate way to respond to the absurd is to rebel against it, then even rebelling against the absurd will, any form of it, at least, will be equally consequential, or not consequential, right? Useless, just like reason is useless in the face of the absurd. So another premise, the quality of an action is determined by its satisfaction of some end or its consequence, right? That a sandwich is good if it's delicious, or my opening the door is a good deed if someone with 2 handfuls of groceries need to walk through that door and that they couldn't open. But if I'm just opening doors, that's not good. And it's because it was for the sake of helping that person get through that the action was good. Okay, so that's just sort of general moral thinking. So if all actions are equally consequential, then the quality of actions cannot determine better from worse lived lives, or lives lived. So an action's quality has no bearing on rebellion against the absurd. If the quality of actions cannot determine the better from the worse, then the criteria for a life well lived must be in the quantity of actions performed in rebellion against the absurd rather than the quality, right? Because quality makes no difference. So the best we can do in rebellion is a lot of rebellion. Hence, in conclusion, lives well lived are those that engage in a large quantity of actions that rebel against the absurd. This was my best shake at constructing an argument from like why Camus thinks that we ought to live lives of quantity rather than quality in the face of the absurd. But I want you guys to examine what's wrong with the argument. So we're going to take 10 minutes. I'll set a timer on my phone. I'm going to put you guys in breakout groups. And normally when I play this game, we do it all like live and together, but we haven't done it before. And so I think it'll be a little bit easier on everybody if we do these breakout groups. So the way the game works, what's wrong with the argument is you have the argument right here in front of you. Okay. And it's also on Canvas in the files if it ends up going away when we do breakout groups. So you can find it there. But the idea is that you want to object to this construction of argument. And there are 3 ways you can do it. You don't have to do all 3 when you break out into your groups, but one of the ways is to reject a premise and then explain why. Why do you think this premise is false? And the premises are marked with P, right? But you could also reject an inference. You could say, yeah, I agree with both of these premises. They're true, but the inference is wrong. What they actually give you is something else. You're wrong in inferring this way. Or alternatively, you can reject my construction of the argument. You can, it's in debate, it's called a critique, right? You say, Spencer, you're ridiculous. This isn't what Camus argues at all. He doesn't actually think these premises or make this inference. He argues something very differently. So that's another valid way of showing what's wrong with the argument. So you can show what's wrong with the argument internally or holistically. Great. So I'm going to pause the recording and we'll come back when, where's my mouse? Try to pause the recording. When we have finished with our breakout. Hello? Okay. Yeah, I turned off my mic. But it's on again and you're all back. So I want to hear what you guys chatted about. What's wrong with the argument? Nothing is wrong with the argument.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah, and then Atticus.
Okay, the idea that the consequences of the action are equal. That seems like it's in conflict with the idea of that you find inner peace because you have no connection with what happens to you. So if the consequences of the action are equal, that doesn't mean that whether you have bad intent or good intent, that's not necessarily equal, right?
There's no such thing as good or bad intent, right? Because good and
Yeah,
bad.
I'm not getting
Oh,
it very
sorry.
well.
Well, good and bad are determined by morals and ethics that assume the ability to decide like what's ultimately good and what's ultimately bad, and that there are these standards by which we can guide our actions in these like morally righteous ways or not. But for the absurd existentialist, there is no good and bad. There is only absurd, right? Okay, Atticus.
I was also in Sarah's group, so it's related.
Cool.
But also we did not reach a conclusion. We were swimming in deep water of like, I raised the problem, which is kind of just rejecting like the whole thing and like absurdity somewhat of like, this seems like a consequentialist argument, and consequentialist arguments are not great in my opinion, of like, if the only thing we're evaluating anything on is a consequence, it leaves a lot of information to be desired. So then like, how do we evaluate the quality of an action if we're only allowed to evaluate the consequence of an action? And I like gave an example of like accidentally shooting somebody versus murdering somebody, and how if we're not allowed to view anything besides the consequence, then those actions are the same. And that doesn't feel great to me, but that's also like, you have to be on board and agree to things like morals and feelings and stuff.
That's cool. That's really clever. And I wonder if that's just the way that I've like written the argument based on what Camus says, or if he would actually be committed to a kind of like absurd consequentialism as well, right? That you're measuring actions in virtue of the way in which they affect the world absurdly or whatever. Yeah, I think it's a cool objection, because you can have someone who is internally, well, I mean, like the whole goal is to be internally oriented with that lucid awareness towards the absurd, so that you're able to say that all is well and imagine Sisyphus happy and all this, right? And that seems to me more the goal than the like doing of a lot, right? The quantity thing, and quantity is determined based on consequences, like the amount of rebellion that you express or perform or whatever it is. So there's at least a little bit of a disconnect in that respect, right? That the affective state of indifference that is supposed to be inspired by an awareness of the absurd doesn't seem to click or jibe totally well with kind of consequential ethic of quantity. So I think that's an interesting objection. Let's do Abby, Scott, and then Quentin.
Yeah, so I think like the first thing that I sort of latched onto was premise one, not because I reject to it, but more it just feels incomplete. Because it says all consequences of action are equal in the absurd, which implies that they're equal in meaning as opposed to meaninglessness. And so like the fact that it's implying value, like an equality of value as opposed to an equality of valuelessness, I think then muddies the waters later on. So if you're saying that all action or all consequences of action are equal in the absurd, and then you continue to like clarify that by saying like equal in like being the absence of value, then quantity wouldn't really be relevant. So yeah, that's what I had to say.
So is the upshot, and I like asking, so I'm wondering if you're going in this direction too, is the upshot of this objection that quantity itself is a kind of absurdity just as well as any kind of quality? That what's the difference between 3 and 4? They're both equally absurd as well. 3 actions from 4 actions of rebellion. And if the difference between those is absurd, then what makes the difference? And so why have an ethic of quantity at all?
Yeah, I think that is like a reframing of what I was saying, but I think that's saying the same thing. It's basically like I saw it in terms of like if all action equals like X value, that's one thing, but if X value equals 0, then the summation of all of those zeros will still amount to 0.
Sure.
So quantity would be,
yeah, and it would take like an absurd logic to say that if 3 and 4 are both equal to 0, that 4 is better than 3, right? Because they're all the same. They're all the same absurd. So I think that's a really cool objection too. That's super clever. Thanks, Abby. Scott, I think, was next, right? And then, yeah, so I have the screen behind me, so I have to like look up to see your faces. So let's do Scott and then Quentin, and then we'll probably move on to the next thing, absurd logic. So go ahead, Scott.
I had a very grounded criticism that was very much in the vein of what you and Abby just talked about. And then I have an absurd criticism, so I'll just go with that one now, which is that
Okay.
I couldn't help but like imagine like physicists like drilling in deeper and deeper into reality, you know, discovering the muons and the Higgs boson, and they keep going and going and going, and they get to the point where they're able to maybe, you know, hack into like the code of the universe, and they get there and they see that the code of the universe is absurd, and they get this opportunity to change it and decide, well, we're going to make the universe into, you know, let's say a Spinozan, hyper-rational, everything is monistic, right? Eliminating all of his critiques here of how the universe is. And wouldn't that be a high quality rebellion against the absurd to end it? And
Cool. All right. So it's like if Neo in the Matrix offered a purple pill to the guy at the bottom of the Matrix in the third movie, what happens then? Uh, to be complete, I have no idea. Kind of a neat idea. I think what Camus would say is that you would never get to the point where you get to the bottom of things because the absurd is ubiquitous. But assuming that you could, then yeah, I think the ultimate rebellion would be to succeed. But the assumption is that we never succeed because there's never any bottom. There's no code in the matrix to unravel eventually. So how do you live without the promise of success? But yeah, if you accepted a different ontological premise that there were a bottom that you could dig down to, that or at least you scientifically discovered it, like you're scientifically agnostic as to the ontology of things, absurd or not, or otherwise. You eventually dug down and hit bedrock, and that bedrock was some sort of code you could change. Then yeah, sure, this book would no longer be useful to us. Yeah, be a
I'll
work
get
of
to work.
poetry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll get on it.
get to work. Yeah, please don't make the world spinozist. All right, Quentin.
Yeah, so mine is kind of bouncing off of what Abby said. And so I'm trying to parse out kind of whether or not Camus wants us to believe there's a distinction between our internal world and the absurd, or whether we're in us looking at it directly, whether we're supposed to exist with it or in it at all times. Because the first premise, all consequences of action are equal in the absurd. Well, like Abby was saying, well, then an ethic isn't going to do us much good anyhow. So I'm thinking in that the very fact that he's saying there is an ethic, then he's saying that, there's got to be something internal that, and to me, saying that there's something internal like that, that sounds like what he calls the existential turning away, from the absurd. So I don't know. I think that might be an issue with the argument altogether.
Yeah. So what Quentin is objecting to is saying that the ethic of quantity is a kind of philosophical suicide, right? Because it's maybe even like a moral code. It's it's normative. It tells us that doing lots is better than doing one thing well. Yeah, and so I even hesitated calling it an ethic of quantity. The reason I called it an ethic is because it has kind of like a normative, prescriptive sort of like, this is how you should practically reason. But the reason I hesitated was for a similar intuition that seems that the idea of there being an ethics at all is incorrect. But then this does have some, or at least it's supposed to have some kind of pragmatic power for our practical reasoning and how we decide to rebel against the absurd. What makes one absurd hero different from Joe Schmo? Yeah. I think that's another really good point to bring out the troubling sort of quality of this idea, the ethic of quantity, though it is one that Camus is committed to. I think even given all of our objections that maybe we can dig down and get rid of the absurd, or that even the idea of quantity is itself absurd, or that the ethic feature of quantity is inconsistent with the rest of the project. I think whether or not we accept Camus' ethic of quantity is not terribly consequential to the rest of the argument, how we're supposed to live, because the crux, the turning point, the touchstone of the solution to the problem of suicide, as Camus expresses it, is this lucid awareness, not turning away. And that's where you get the all is well. That's where it all comes from. How that ends up looking can get a little strange and weird, as we see here. But you can get rid of this and still have that, like, the force of power that comes from the lucid awareness. Atticus.
I have a question that might be spirally, so if it is, feel free to shut it down. But it seems like there's some, and it's kind of related to Abby's comments also, like there's this effort to not assign value or like these like morally prescriptive words to actions, right? And I feel like if we're not allowed to use those like value laden statements in terms to actions, why do we get to use those statements at all when it comes to like what a well life is? Because that's also like, I don't know, like if we can evaluate in this value-based way what a life is, why can't we do that to actions? And like, why are those separate categories?
Yeah, so this is another good objection. This is pointing at probably number 7, right? And maybe even like the conclusion inferred from 6 and 7. And so again, I hedged at the beginning, like I did my best to like characterize the argument. He doesn't use the language of like well-lived life or whatever. That was just like the best way that I could like make this clear, because the argument that he gives is not in like an analytic form at all. And so I impose that language, and so you're absolutely right to point that out as inconsistent. And even so, I think, you know, disregarding my the like necessity of my like, or you know, at least the incapacity for me to like render the argument without using that kind of language, it still seems applicable to the objection that Akis brought up. Still seems applicable to Camus, right? That seems that he's saying a life of a lot of rebellion is better than a life of a little. And if we don't, if all is the same in the absurd, and we don't have these like normative criteria to judge differences between lives well lived, righteous, or otherwise, then you know we shouldn't be able to make that judgment for lives of quantity of different amounts as well. So I think you're spot on there with that objection. And I mean, it makes me wonder what Camus would say. I'm like trying to think to myself, how would I respond to this if I were Camus? And I might just say that it's not a matter of like moral force that the life of quantity is better than one of not, but rather of just sort of necessity, that insofar as one becomes aware of the absurd, they have their 3 consequences, and then they just rebel a lot, right? But that doesn't seem quite right either, because it's not true in practice, right? The person who's lucidly aware of the absurd doesn't, there's no like absolute reason that they rebel a lot in a lot of different ways, that you have to be a Don Juan that, you know, loves many, many women. Why couldn't you just love one person and in the right sort of indifferent way, or you know, however it's supposed to go? Seems very little difference there. So I really don't know how Camus would defend this.
Doesn't he address that though when he gets to the creator? When like I think he says like I can't remember exactly, but like only painting one painting that wouldn't be enough like for an artist in the midst of the absurd. You know, I don't know, and I think that's kind of a gross way of looking at the Don Juanism, definitely. But I guess that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. So is the artist justified in creating just one great work? Well, every work that they create is of the same idea. That's like supposed to be the one inspired idea of the artist's life. And there's a character in The Plague who does this, who wants to write just one perfect sentence, and he's not supposed to be like the great hero of the story. He sort of makes a mistake, and he's, although admirable, not a perfect absurd hero. Quentin?
Yeah, I remember where he said it now. It was in the section with the actor, and he says like the actor asks themselves, why would you want to live just one life when you could, you know, incorporate
all the characters? Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Sarah says maybe he's just suggesting that you don't have to withdraw from life experience and engaging fully with life, even in the context of releasing any sense of control over how one's actions may result in consequences to self or others, like the Buddhist idea of disconnecting from outcomes, recognizing one's lack of control over that. Like living more is just engaging as an agent, a life force, not withdrawing, suicidal, depressive. Yeah, and I think you're on the right track, Sarah. If Camus has to give any sort of answer, this like psychological one, I think is probably the closest that you could get to like a valid explanation. And so the idea would be to step back from the force of argument that this is how an absurd hero lives or should live or whatever, and you just say that it's all right for them to live in this way. Which doesn't give you the sort of strength and power that you might want from an exemplification of a character in a story or in a life, but it is at least a justification for its presence there and how this feature might work or be made sense of in the absurd hero's characters' lives that he does portray. But it is sort of stepping back from the ubiquity of an ethic of quantity for absurd heroes sort of across the board. But I think you are definitely on the right track there. So, okay, so let's move on because we have one more group exercise to do today. So the final feature of the absurd hero's life is the absurd logic, which this meme had nothing to do with existentialism, but I totally thought that this was like absurd logic at play. I was this kid, absolutely, when I was little. So what is the absurd logic? Well, it's a logic built on something like a contradiction. Its reason spins and its threads fly in every which way. It seems to make no sense whatsoever. And what binds together the inferences of an absurd logic are only the three consequences: the revolt, freedom, and passion. And from these perspectives, all is permitted. And this all is permitted might even be a conclusion of a kind of absurd logic. And in order to exemplify the absurd logic, Camus discusses Kirilov's logical suicide from the possessed or demons, Dostoevsky's novel. So Kirilov adds to his fatal logic an extraordinary ambition, which gives the character its full perspective, which reveals the absurd secret in all of its purity. He wants to kill himself to become God. If God does not exist, then Kirilov is God, because Kirilov has all of the freedom to do whatever, everything is permitted, and this is godlike, right? The extent of his will is unlimited. And so if there is no God and the extent of his will is unlimited, then he is God. But if God does not exist, then Kirilov must kill himself. Kirilov must therefore kill himself to become God. And the idea is that if God does not exist and the extent of Kirilov's will is unlimited, then the most free act that he could perform is to kill himself, because it's the only act that is completely contrary to like everything else about him. And so he doesn't kill himself because he's turning away from the absurd. He's killing himself as like an empowerment of his freedom. And this is to be contrasted with an ethic of quality, because Kirilov's logical suicide is like the most qualitatively powerful act that you could perform, right? And this is why Camus eventually objects to Kirilov's logical suicide. But it is at least consistent with the rest of the absurd hero's characterizations. And this logic, if God does not exist, then Kirilov is God. If God does not exist, Kirilov must kill himself. Therefore, Kirilov must kill himself to become God, is absolutely absurd logic. That logic is absurd, but it's what is needed, says Camus. And I'm going to be I have no idea what this is supposed to mean or why it is the way that it is. I will admit that it is an incredibly powerful scene, and it gets you a feel in a particular sort of way. And that might be all that there is in an absurd logic, is whatever je ne sais feeling lives behind the veil of the absurdity of a logical suicide or an exclamation of one. Or even maybe it's the same feeling that lives behind Oedipus's all as well. You feel a sort of power in that. But it's the absurd logic that leads one to conclude as such in awareness of the absurd, that gives you the all is well, and in order to become God, he must kill himself, logical suicide. And so the difference here between an existentialist and an absurdist, and Camus makes this distinction, is that the existentialist commits to quantity rather than quality, whereas the absurdist is trying to like qualitatively empower themselves in the absurd, and the existentialist says suicide is no good because it cuts off our ability to rebel, and rebellion is the only way to make this work, that is existence in the absurd. And so Kirilov's logical suicide seeks equality through an expression of infinite or unbounded freedom to make him, to raise himself up to not a God man, right? God dash man, but man dash God is the idea. He is a human extrapolated rather than a God reinterpreted. And those are supposed to be different ideas. So Kirilov is not an absurd hero as Camus would have it, but rather an exemplification of the first steps an absurd hero takes in deciding how to act or be or live. This is the absurd logic. And if you'd like to see more of an exemplification without having to read the entire, like, chunk of The Possessed, because that's another, like, all of Dostoevsky's big novels are huge commitments. But if you want to see more of the way that Camus envisions absurd logic working, read Caligula. So the way that Camus published, he published in cycles of 3, where there would be philosophical essay, novel, and play. He was a playwright too. Caligula is the play that completes the trilogy of the myth of Sisyphus and the Stranger, and Caligula was a Roman emperor, young guy who had a fever and then lost his mind and did all sorts of crazy stuff. And Camus renders Caligula in this play as his absurd hero who does nothing but reason absurdly. It's an awesome play. It's really good. And it's pretty short too. I mean, plays have to be. So the lover, the actor, and the adventurer. Camus gives us these 3 examples. We have Don Juan, who loves equally many times. Every love is just as powerful. It is true love in every case. We have an ethic of quantity. Every love is complete, though the project of loving never ends. There's an absurd logic. Why continue loving at all? Well, you make the absurd reasoning. And finally, the lover dies alone, used up, unable to continue because of the ruinous age and decrepitude of his body. So there's a tragedy of fate. Likewise, the mime of the ephemeral, which is a really fun way of saying actor. Put that on your resume if you're in the theater department. I'm a mime of the ephemeral. Every role is a complete life and being whose existence flickers between the pulling open and closed of the curtains on the stage. This is an ethic of quantity, that you act many characters' lives. The lives, narrative, and story all complete themselves through the actors, who then must return to their constructed world of reality and absurdity. And this is an absurd logic. How do you be the character that you are and also the person that you are at once without an absurd logic? How can you be 2 things at once? You can't. Well, you can, and that's what's needed somehow. Finally, the actor is trying to convince through appearances, knowing that all the while they are none of their appearances, but isn't the person that they are in their real life just as much an appearance? And this is the tragedy of the actor. Prometheus, conqueror, adventurer, guides great powers to become great nations, all the while knowing that all action is useless, which is an ethic of quantity. You become an Alexander. You don't need all of the world, and yet you conquer anyways. You Hellenize. Revolutions accomplish themselves, but rebellion is everlasting, right? A revolution overcomes the regime, but rebellion against the absurd never ends. So how do you revolt against the world and yet rebel against the absurd? It requires an absurd logic. And again, conquerors are capable of living at great heights, though what it is to be human is to live in your small human way. And this is the tragedy, that the man God must also be a man, right? Sort of thing. Or maybe it's the God man must also be a man. Okay. And again, these are only examples. Anyone can be an absurd hero just as long as they remain lucidly aware of the absurd. So I'm going to impose on you guys another group activity. Hopefully this one is just as fun, if not better. You and your classmates have acquired enough donations to finally get your startup, Absurd, a think tank, off the ground. You were interested in bringing an absurdist politician to power in the United States as the first member of the A party. You must first find an appropriate candidate, however, who embodies your think tank's values and political agenda. So here's your assignment. Create an advertisement bulletin, like a page that, like a paragraph where you could like put pictures, like get creative, whatever you want. that does these three things, do all of them, right? What value does the A party support or values? What will be the A party's first bill proposed in Congress? And Republicans and Democrats have their donkeys and elephants. What's the A party's mascot or symbol? Kind of like a fun one. There's rules. So because I'm like inviting you to be political, I'm also going to demand that you be respectful. Okay. So don't get edgy and cringy and be a jerk to your classmates. Like be, like understand that we're working together to, help illuminate a philosophical concept and not to be right. Okay. So be respectful. And also no contemporary or real values or bills allowed. So like values enjoyed by Democrats or Republicans or libertarians or Green Party people, none of that is allowed. You can't choose like values that are actually out there in the political sphere or bills. So infrastructure bill, that's boring. Why would an absurdist want better roads? This is the absurdist party. Be absurd. Okay. So take 15 minutes, and the best political poster from your group will earn 2 points each. So make sure to put your names on it. And at home, if you'd like to do this as well, you have until Friday, July 16th. I think that's this Friday, to send me your poster. And then after the 16th, I'll evaluate them all and give you guys the bonus points. So I'm asking you to like do something a little goofy and a little silly, but there is a principled reason for this. Like there is like some philosophical content that what Camus is doing and describing the absurd hero as a way to live, how to live, and what politics is like how to live together, how we coexist. And so if Camus were to be, like the candidate of the A party, what would the political platform be? How would Camus, given what we know about the absurd hero, legislate to make a society of absurd heroes, right? And so like, it's a like goofy, silly, fun assignment, but that's the idea. It's like, think about what it would be to live in a world full of people like this and what that world would need in order to persist and exist. And that's what you should be thinking about when you're creating the values and the bill that you're going to propose, and maybe even to inspire your mascot. Okay, so I'm going to break you out into breakout groups one more time, and you'll have 15 minutes, and then we'll complete the myth of Sisyphus. Let me pause the recording again. Okay, welcome back to the recording. If you want to turn in your posts or posters, your bulletins to me from home, for those of you who were not in class today, you may do so until Friday. There are lots of really fun ideas. Move on to the end of the lecture. Okay, so the end of the myth of Sisyphus deals with the artist and with art. Camus says, all those lives maintained in the rarefied air of the absurd could not persevere without some profound and constant thought to infuse its strength in them. And this is the inspiration, this is the passion, right? How does one live in the absurd? Well, they have their passion, they have their inspiration, they have this strong idea. And it's merely a matter of being faithful to the rule of the battle, of that idea inspiring rebellion. That thought may suffice to sustain a mind. War cannot be negated. One must live or die of it. So it is with the absurd. It is a question of breathing with it, of recognizing its lessons and recovering their flesh. In this regard, the absurd joy par excellence is creation. Art and nothing but art, said Nietzsche. We have art in order not to die of the truth. It's a fun quote. So to live in lucid awareness of the absurd is to be depleted, as Camus tells us. And to be depleted is not only to lose the battle and to run out of juice, but also the will to go on fighting, because you're all out of juice. And yet there's an energy that inspires rebellion in us. In spite of being depleted, we continually find ourselves as absurd heroes, inspired to fight against the absurd. It's an energy gained from breathing with it, one profound, constant thought and inspiration. But how can an artistic inspiration of this sort avoid philosophical suicide, not become an illusion that makes us confuse its reality for the reality of the absurd? Well, the absurd discovery coincides with a pause in which future passions are prepared and justified. And it's called Lovers 2 by René Magritte. He was an awesome surrealist painter. This is, I think, my favorite painting. It's a good one. So what this means is the discovery of a creative inspiration consistent with the absurdist indifference is necessary, or is a necessary fuel to continue living. And this inspiration is not hopeful in that it explains why the future must be what it is, because I'm carving this marble for the sake of the David to be, but rather it justifies experiencing that future period at all, right? It's not that the future will be because I have this inspiration and I'm working towards the completion of the idea. No, the inspiration is supposed to be an ongoing one, right? That as long as we are inspired and aware of the absurd, our goal is not to create and settle questions, but to continue asking them in as many ways as we can. And this is good advice. I do a little bit of research on midlife crises. And the way that midlife crises get characterized is that you set up your entire life with goals, right? You want a certain career, a certain salary, a family, a white picket fence, all that, right? And by the time you're 35, 45, 55, right? Whenever you satisfy all of those goals that you set up for yourself when you were, 15, 18, 20, like young person, you complete college, you complete graduate school, you complete the career, you complete the salary, you complete the family, and then what? Now what? You set up your life so that you're just satisfying goals and then you're all out of them. So you buy a Porsche and hope that makes everything okay. The Porsche is only a representation of what you should have done really early on, which is to set up an interminable sort of end or goal, one that drives you forward continuously, that doesn't satisfy itself, but with completion and moving behind you. It's one that's always with you, like the Porsche, but one that isn't material like a Porsche, or a kind of not fantastic sporty car like a Porsche or a Mini Cooper, whatever it is. Okay, so meaning is made by describing the absurd as you know it to be through your experience of it, not explaining it away, not explaining the absurd now for the sake of some future, not hoping, but describing, right? And this is the artistic creation, is the description, which we saw in The Stranger, right? That every sentence was a description rather than an explanation. And what you know the absurd to be is your own fate, your own fated lot in that absurd. It's who you are, whether that be a Don Juan, a Prometheus, an artist, an actor, whomever. And so what does this art look like? What does a creation consist in? Camus says, for an absurd work of art to be possible, thought in its most lucid form must be involved in it. The work of art is born of the intelligence's refusal to reason the concrete. It marks the triumph of the carnal. So art begins where thinking ends, just as the absurd begins where reason becomes useless, right? And so what's left is experience, is the body in the world, is being, capital B, being, right? And by being, we are doing art. And when we do it with this inspiration, we create things like Georgia O'Keeffe's Blue and Green music. This is at the Chicago Institute of Art. O'Keeffe did a series where this was, I think, the best one of the series, of trying to represent sound in paint. And so this is her interpretation of song. And it looks a lot like the Northern Lights, which I think is cool. Lots of motion in it, but still having strong, solid lines. Anyways, Camus also says expression begins where thought ends, which is just to say that art begins with intelligence and ends with experience. You don't get art without intelligence because you don't get absurd without reasoning yourself to it, but you also don't get rebellion without that visceral je ne sais feeling that, oh, is my mic dead?
We can hear you.
Oh,
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I never know how old these chat messages are, sorry. Okay, so you need reason to get you to the point of absurd, just like you needed to get you to the point of an inspiration, a modus operandi through which your artistic creation will come to be. But the way it comes to be and what it is carnal. It's the body, it's being. So under another aspect, the same is true for music. If any art is devoid of lessons, it is certainly music. That game the mind plays with itself according to set and measured laws takes place in the sonorous compass that belongs to us, and beyond which the vibrations nevertheless meet in an inhuman universe. There is no pure sensation. The absurd hero recognizes as his own these harmonies and these forms, which I think is like totally beautiful expression of like what music is. Super cool. And I put one of my favorite songs that I think is really expressive of this idea at the bottom there too, if you want to listen to it later. Use headphones, good ones for that song. So if that's what the absurd art is, how does the absurd artist, the creator, the absurd hero create? What is this sort of person like? Samsara, there's no words, it's just music and images. It was filmed over the course of 5 years. It's about culture and spirituality and like human experience. It's amazing. I think it's on Amazon Prime too. Fantastic movie. That's what this is from. So Camus says, to work and create for nothing, to sculpture and clay, to know that one's creation has no future, to see one's work destroyed in a day while being aware that fundamentally this has no more importance than building for centuries. This is the difficult wisdom that absurd thought sanctions. Performing these two tasks simultaneously, negating on the one hand, or at the bottom here, and magnifying on the other, in the top GIF, is the way to open, is the way open to the absurd creator. He must give the void its colors. Beautiful. Which is to say that we might think that the absurd artist creates without attachment, similar to like this Buddhist way of creating, the mandala, right? The intricate, these mandalas, by the way, are 3-dimensional, that it's sand that's created in a 2-dimensional plane, but they're made so that you can imagine them in 3 dimensions. So they're more than just like top-down representations. They have like depth to them. I think is amazing. And then they wipe them clean as soon as it's done. Goodbye, giving the void its colors. So creation here is for the sake of nothing other than the strengthening of one's rebellion against the absurd, giving the void its colors. It's not for the sake of what you're creating or for the sake of pictorializing or representing some essential aesthetic or ethical feature of the world, but rather only for the sake of rebellion, of giving the void its colors. And so this leads us to meaning making. The absurd artist who creates in this way, who creates absurd works of art like music, meaning makes for themselves. This leads to a special conception of the work of art. Too often, the work of a creator is looked upon as a series of isolated testimonies. Thus, artist and man of letters are confused. A profound thought is in a constant state of becoming. It adopts the experience of a life and assumes its shape. Likewise, a man's sole creation is strengthened in its successive and multiple aspects, his works. There is no mystery in human creation. Will performs this miracle. But at least there is no true creation without a secret. To be sure, a succession of works can be but a series of approximations of the same thought. From death, for instance, they derive their definitive significance. They receive their most obvious light from the very life of their author. At the moment of death, the succession of his works is but a collection of failures. But if those failures all have the same resonance, the creator has managed to repeat the image of his own condition to make the air echo with the sterile secret that he possesses. So these are the important features of this quote here. And this is where we get a quality of meaning making. And maybe like if there is any prescriptive claim to come from Camus' existentialist project, which you typically hear is the world is absurd, so make your own meaning. And you think, well, great, I can just do what I want. And as long as I think it's meaningful, then it is. That's not what meaning making is. And that's like a total bastardization of the existentialist project. This is what meaning making is. This repeating, this inspired idea for which we are unattached, which is just giving the void its colors, that wiped away is just as much a part of the art as scrubbed down onto the floor in its form, right? That every idea is a new expression of the part of us that is the lot that we are fated to have in existence, in an absurd existence. And every expression of that is just as absurd as every other. Every creation is just as liable to be blown away, is just as liable to be as meaningless as every other. And yet there is a resonance to it. And that resonance is the meaning making that we do in our rebellion against the absurd through artistic creation. Okay, so we make our own meaning, not simply by choosing whatever we want. That would be a vulgar philosophical suicide. It would be a turning away from the absurd. Rather, meaning is made in the recursive failures, though self-strengthening, of inspired rebellion against absurdity. And they're failures again because everything's absurd and we're fated to, always be in the absurd. So our creative lot in this absurd is not to make the world pretty, like, oh, it's meaningful to me, I like it. But rather to make the world that is absurd a reflection of ourselves, to shine our color through into the void. And we don't get to choose what our color is. It is what it will be. We are a lover, we are a conqueror, we are an artist. Maybe all three, maybe none of them. Maybe we're just a store clerk or a politician trying to create the A party, whatever it is, right? But what we are, we have a color, and it is by accepting the absurd and allowing that color to shine through into it that we meaning make for ourselves. And so finally, we get the myth of Sisyphus. And this is where we'll conclude the lecture. So I talked about the myth of Sisyphus at the beginning, and I won't recount it again here. But what matters in life, in rebellion against the absurd, is not to turn away, to leap, or to give in to hopelessness. Even where there is no hope, there can still be life, right? This is why the problem of suicide, if we take this middle path that Camus is guiding us down towards, we don't need to think of suicide or philosophical suicide as problems. Rather, what matters is simply being able to say, in spite of it all is well. The world doesn't need to be anything more than what it is for this exclamation to be justified, that all is well. Nor do we humans, as we are, need to be anything more either. We don't need to be God men or man God or whatever. We already are what we are, and that's enough to exclaim that all is well. And maybe in that small sense, meet the absurd to match it, right? So what justifies the exclamation is our attitude and our posture. Can we accept the gratuitousness of an absurd existence and be, capital B, what fate makes of us anyways? Can we be the Oedipus? Can we be the Sisyphus? Are we able to find strength in no other source than what is to be ourselves in spite of it all? And if so, how could it be possible but to exclaim that, yes, all is well? And so Camus leaves us that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Great. So I'll end the recording there and see you all next week. Also stick around if you guys want to chat or have questions. We went a little bit long today, so I want to just like give everyone the, oh, I'm still recording, give everybody the option of hopping out. But if you do want to stick around, I will be here to field questions and stuff. But I will end the recording and let y'all go.